This is Preston McKee from Morris Baker Funeral Home, and the purpose today, and I'm Carolyn Merriman, and I'm going to conduct an interview for the end-of-life interprofessional course for ETSU. And so we wanted to welcome
absolutely.
and we wanted to, may I call you Preston?
Sure.
Okay, we wanted to interview you and get a perspective. We have a whole module on funerals and memorials and what's the purpose of those. And so that's the reason I wanted to have an interview with you today.
Sure.
Okay. So to start, I just want to ask you, from your perspective, what do you feel like the purpose of funerals are?
Oh gosh.
What do you, I mean, in your
Start
role,
with an easy one.
Yeah, start with an easy one. Well, you want to start with a different one, you can.
You know, the way I think in analogies, and sometimes that can be good and sometimes that can be bad. But for me, to a large degree, what we deal with analogies, with funerals, is I imagine going down the interstate you're going down the interstate in a caravan with your loved ones, your family, right? You're going down the road and you're leading the caravan. You look in the rearview mirror and your family's car isn't there anymore. How would you react? Would that be of comfort? Would you worry? Would you feel unsettled? Would you want to know, were they in a wreck? Did they just take an off-ramp and I didn't see them? And so kind of pausing and recognizing the transition, allowing ourselves some time to process the new reality with our relationship and with that person in a new context, acknowledging what has happened, acknowledging of what is going to happen in the future. And I think that having some kind of meaningful event helps people process that. One person says when you don't know what to say, sometimes you know what to do, because the ritual gives you that familiar action to act out your beliefs and your circumstances.
So, in other words, it provides a meaningful event to help families transition into that new reality, is what you said.
Yeah. It's a major shift in the context of their relationships, and I think whenever there's a major shift like that, it can take a while to digest, to metabolize the new reality. And when people can come and surround you and acknowledge that reality, when there's a good group of people, that communicates a lot of times the legacy of the person that passed away. And that helps people process the meaning of the life and focus more sometimes on the gratitude of it. Now, not everyone has a great relationship with the person that passed away, and there can be all kinds of contexts, but I can tell you many times families communicate how much benefit they get from seeing the turnout for a service. That's why a lot of times at services, I thank the people that are there and also give them a little lesson in how important it is just to be there. Because I think a lot of times we're intimidated about going to a service because you think, well, I didn't really know this person or that person, or I don't really know what to say. But really the presence is what makes the difference.
So I can see that, because the presence, I mean, sometimes it's just really encouraging, or, makes you feel more at peace to know that so many people were affected by that loved one's life, I think.
Yes.
So, what do you think that your role is in all of this? In the funeral, in the memorialization, what do you see as your major role?
Well, as it comes to the service itself, we primarily facilitate the service for the person that's running the service. And that's typically either a minister, or like today there wasn't a minister they wanted to utilize, so he used our celebrant, and they were able to give structure to the service that primarily consisted of stories from the people who were there. But we help with the logistics, but also connecting them to the resources, making sure people are aware of why we do things. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people and they ask, why do I need to do this? Why do we need to see our family member? Why do we need to, and talk about the value and talk about people's feedback that we've served in the past. And the number of times people come back and go, I didn't realize that I needed this. I didn't realize how much benefit I would get from doing this. And so that's our job, is just to try to gently try to educate people in that difficult stage. And that's why we advocate so much for prearrangement. When the death is not near, people are much more receptive. You can trigger thoughts and then allow them to go talk to their loved ones about it and try to reconcile what different people's wishes are. And there's a bit of a rush when someone passes away, just because you have this logistic need of someone's died and their body needs to be taken care of. So it can definitely, and maybe people only get 3 days off from work, which is crazy, but it has to be done, and so decisions kind of have to be forced.
So just for your personal background or your staff's, it sounds like you do quite a bit of logistics and management, and also sometimes counseling skills. So what kind of background do you all bring to this as far as that goes? What do you think is needed?
As far as education?
Yeah.
I have a degree in economics.
Yeah.
Third world and environmental. Not very useful. But I'll tell you, the thing that's really, so I'm the third generation in my family to be a funeral director. I've grown up around it, hearing the stories around the dining room table on Sundays. So it's very familiar to me in that context. But really, there's no greater education than experience, being exposed to different circumstances, saying the wrong thing, saying the right thing, and I've really sought a lot of learning as time went on with people who are experts in the meaning of ritual, as well as people who are experts in grief, and that's been a great deal of what I've gotten value from. I received a lot of value from being trained as a celebrant. All of our funeral directors here, that's part of their continuing education, is to become a celebrant within the first few years of them being here. And part of that is to understand the importance of the ritual, to be able to empathize with the person that's actually running the service, and to be able to try to communicate the value of the different aspects of it.
So a celebrant is someone who discovers or works with a family to see what their culture rituals are,
Yes.
and then honors that,
Yes.
and just facilitates. Is that correct?
Yes. Because a lot of times, as a friend of mine says, the younger generation, sometimes, unfortunately, they go to a funeral and, as my friend says, Preacher Green, just brings fire and brimstone. And then they leave that and they think, well, gosh, I don't want to have a funeral, thinking that is the only context in which you can have a funeral. So a celebrant is someone that's trained to basically ask a family, where on the scale of 0 to 10 on the religion meter do you want the service to be? And then to be able to work with the family to design a meaningful, personal service for their loved one. So if someone didn't have a history in the church, don't try to create some false narrative. Just try to reflect the life and acknowledge the grief that people are having, and that's much more healing than being in a situation where you feel like the life and the service don't reconcile. So a friend of mine once told me that that was the big thing in his life. He was in his 60s. He said, whether the deceased is present or not, cremation or burial, irrelevant. Whether he felt like he got the value from the service was whether or not it was an accurate reflection of the person's life. And so that's what we try to do and try to encourage people towards
doing that.
Yes.
So that even the family members don't sculpt something that's not a reflection of who the person was.
Yes.
Do you sometimes have family conflicts about that?
Oh gosh, yeah, conflict is massive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's just it's a people dysfunction is the norm, and so that's another reason why we encourage people to put down their wishes, because I call it a magic pill or a magic bullet. I've seen it around the same table, where you bring out the file on the family that's arguing, and you can say, well, this is what your dad said he wanted. And they go, oh gosh, and everyone looks at it, and it's no longer an area of dispute. If Dad wanted it this way, this is how we're going to do it. And they're able to have an effective interaction and have a meaningful service and be able to get through the process much better. So
That's great.
I've seen it in my own family. Yeah.
Well, you said that you've had 3 generations of family members involved in being directors of funeral services. So how do you feel like that, and you talked about it at Sunday dinner, so part of what we're exploring in this course is just the meaning of death and dying, and there's all different levels. There's psychology students, there's nurse practitioner students, medical students, social work. So how do you see your perspective of dying been formed, just throughout your life and in your observations?
Oh gosh. Well, I think I was just walking with my wife this morning, and I was telling her, I said, I think I'm realizing I'm having some of those classic midlife crisis questions. I'm going to turn 45 in just about a month, and you kind of become mindful of certain things that you're doing. But the big thing is we're human, and a lot of times what I tell people is when a member of our family dies, we cross over to the other side of the table instantaneously. We're no longer the funeral director, we're the son, the grandchild. For me and for a lot of people, I guess the way death affects us is kind of in the sense of, I think you'd have to have some kind of a positive faith around it or a positive viewpoint around it as far as death itself to be able to do the work.
Right.
And I've known people that are very effective that are deeply religious, and I've known people that were effective that were atheists. But their viewpoint and the way they process and the interpretation of things as positive in the end was a big driver for them, and that was what enabled them to work in funeral service for X amount of years. So,
well, what do you find in your role to be the most rewarding?
when people come to you and talk to you about the fact that they would not have engaged in something if it weren't for your advice, and then how grateful they are for that advice and for that action. Someone I went to school with, his mother passed away after a long battle with cancer, and originally it was only meant that just a couple people in the family were going to view. My friend, his family members, just a couple of them were going to come in and view just for the sake of just confirming that we took good care of their mom, and no one else was going to view. And those two people viewed. Then they told the family how great she looked. Then more people viewed. And then the day I was talking to my friend, it was the day after, where before they went for the service, all the extended family came in and viewed. And he was in the lobby just talking about how meaningful it was to see his mom outside of the context of fighting the cancer outside of the context of the hospital or hospice bed, and to see her at rest and at peace. And so that a lot of times is our challenge, because a lot of times people want to just get it over with.
Right.
When it's just, I think that when they do that, they neglect their personal needs. I had another friend of mine recently who lost his wife after a chronic illness. She had injured herself in a fall, and he told me how valuable it was to see her with the wounds corrected cosmetically. And so just to kind of have that concept of seeing someone whole and normal as opposed to being in the medical context.
Yes. I hadn't thought about that, and that's really beautiful story.
So,
What do you think is the most difficult that you deal with in your work?
the most difficult things is, the most difficult for me as a business owner is that every once in a while something doesn't go well. And it's not an overcooked hamburger.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not, oh, we'll get you another one out right away, sir. It's something happened and it can't be fixed. And it can sometimes be just tremendously emotional to the people.
So you're talking about, for instance, preparing the body a certain way, or some other ritual that they wanted, or something like that?
Yeah, something, a little thing like that. It's or that's not necessarily little, but for instance, like if the funeral director leaves the table thinking the family doesn't want military honors at the graveside, but the family leaves the table thinking that they do want military honors at the graveside, there's that disconnect. And then the family shows up at the graveside and there's no military honors there.
Yes.
That might have been something that, because of that discussion, that the funeral director thought was a conclusion not to have it, was a discussion that got them really believing that they do want to have it.
Right.
And because there was a miscommunication, then it's not there. It can be just, it can really just sometimes, for whatever reason, psychologically or sleep deprivation or who knows what, I mean, they can just be furious.
Right.
And it can be really, and sometimes it can get personal. You know, it's not a human being that made a mistake. It's big.
I'm sure.
That's the hardest thing,
because for whatever the emotional, again, adding the emotion, the fatigue.
Oh yeah.
Probably even sometimes, sometimes it's caregiver stress.
Yeah.
All those things.
Yeah. Tell if you really want to hurt a funeral director, tell him he doesn't care. Or her.
Yeah.
And sometimes just that's the hardest part of the job. Is thankfully it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
But it does happen sometimes, and we try to do our best to learn from every mistake. We really try to own them and honor them. But despite, sometimes it can be really tough.
So what do you think would be the most important advice, or something that you could share with the students, the graduate students that are watching this, as far as what we can do as professionals to better serve the clients as they're going through end of life and then through the transition of coming into your care?
Trying to think about how to say it succinctly. I guess the big thing about it is to not impose your values upon the patient. And I think there are different things that I've encountered and some different things that I've heard about where, like for instance, as people say, what do you not like to see or hear? And the thing I say is, I hate when the dying put rules upon the living, because it's a regular phone call that we get for how much is a cremation. So cremation is a means of disposition, but you can still have services with the cremation, just like you can have services with the burial. Have you thought about the services you'd like to have? And they'll say, oh, Mama said she'd haunt us. That is a very common quote. She would haunt us if we did anything. And they want to have something. And so the thing I sometimes will say, if I feel safe in saying it, is, if you believe in a better place you go afterwards, and if you can imagine that you can see your loved ones from that place, and there's something that could help them feel better, do you think you would really say no? If you're in a better place, vanity or whatever, isn't going to follow you there.
Mm-hmm.
But your family's going to be here. And it's, so that's kind of where the dying put the rules upon the living, limiting their opportunity for a meaningful experience to recognize the fact they lost someone they loved. But also, too, as a professional, it's important for us not to, and I put funeral directors in the same way, to try to understand where the people are and try to support them in that place. Some places in other communities, from what I understand, hospice, and the local hospice or community is not like that, not like this here, but they would really send people towards direct disposition, which is no viewing, no service, just take care of the cremated body, and we'll have a memorial service at the end of the year for all of our hospice patients. In large metro areas, that's become more and more of a challenge. It's and that makes decisions for people, and I think it's really important for them to be supported in what they feel like they need.
Mm-hmm.
And for some people, it is just a cremation with no formal ceremony. For some people, it's a barbecue, and it's not having a formal religious ritual. It's a party. It's a, and we're supportive of all that. Not everything has to involve a funeral home, but I do think it's important for the transition to be acknowledged in that personal way that I was speaking of before. That's a reflection of the life that's lived.
So for professionals, like the students that are watching this, just to also be careful not to impose as they're talking to someone who's going through end of life, not to impose their views on that person's decision making.
Yes.
Correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And as a funeral director, you always have concern that people will perceive you as having a bias because you want to make money and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And we are a business. I call it a business with a social conscience, but it is a business. But I think the same rule can be applied towards not encouraging someone to have a service that they don't want or need, as it could also be used for not encouraging someone not to have a service that they want or that they feel like they need. And so that for us, we talk about some kind of common human needs that we have and how the components of a funeral ritual support them, right? So we can talk about how they support it, but we don't force anything. Some people might want every component. Some people might just want one or two. And so we take our job at that point in time, kind of having been given the boundaries by the family, to imbue those components with as much meaning as possible. So, does that make sense?
It makes sense. Mm-hmm.
And so it's just always honoring where they are and where they want to be.
So do you work frequently with people who are establishing before their end of life, establishing what they want?
Sure.
So I mean, do you have those kinds of conversations with them about
Yes.
like the fact that just letting them to explore, even though you say you don't want this, what do you think about your family?
So I tend to have, in those situations for me, I tend to have very open-ended conversations, and sometimes it's 2 or 3 meetings before things are decided upon. And that gives people an opportunity to process and digest the information. And because a lot of times when people do say, they a lot of times they think about in terms of what they don't want. I don't want this. I don't want to be yelled at by a preacher. I don't want this, or I don't want that. And so it can be kind of talking about, well, why do we have different elements? And have you asked your children what they think? Where are your children? Because a lot of the children are spread out. And so particularly when it's a sudden passing, it's very important to see the person. The prime example is like the Malaysian airline that went down in the Pacific. I don't think they ever found it. But there was one American, and his fiance said every time they show a piece of the plane that's found floating in the ocean, I think, well, maybe he's clinging to it. So it's that unresolved thing, and I think our minds can really play tricks on us. And so when we see someone, it allows us to flip some subconscious switches in our brain that tells us this is our reality. Now it doesn't fix that, but at least it at least establishes one truth.
So we've been exploring also a little bit about children and death and dying. So what is your perspective about children and their exposure to funerals and your experience with, what is there a certain age appropriate, or what is your thoughts on that?
So we have material for that. So the big thing is, if people are curious about it particularly, we have resources we can give people for free. In general speaking, in the interest of time and videotape, or if it's not tape anymore, that's how old I am. But if a child is old enough to love, they're old enough to grieve. And I would err on the side of inclusion. Now, if there are certain circumstances of trauma or something like that, but I think typically what I've seen children think of is when they're protected, they feel a lot of times excluded. They feel a second-class citizenship, and as opposed to being included, part of the family, the relationship they had with the deceased to be legitimized and honored. So again, there can be different situations. Every child's different. Every death is different. But the truth of the matter, my mother's father, her biological father, died when she was 6, and she was excluded from the service. She was sheltered, and that really informed her practice as a funeral director. And so she always really worked towards including children and honoring that relationship, and I've seen the benefit of that.
So, I love that statement, though. If they're old enough to love, they're old enough to grieve. And I've seen that in my own family. But one of the things that we talk about in pediatric nursing is if you have a child, the exposure to maybe death or dying comes with like the loss of pets and other things that builds up their sense of what death is about, and or finality. But that even going to other people's funeral that they did not necessarily love, but it was just the experience.
Yeah.
Does that seem to help, do you think, with children's comfort when they experience someone they loved?
Yes. It's something to, it's when something is, it's kind of like when death is like Voldemort, and it's something that should not be named, it becomes this taboo situation to be feared and dreaded. And I think in the absence of information being provided, in many places in life, in absence of information being provided, we will come up with our own. And when we do come up with our own, I find it's typically based upon our biases and our fears and our insecurities. So if you can just be truthful, it's far less than what someone can come up with. And I would refer you to, there's a Birds and the Bees episode of This American Life on NPR that talks about a support group for children who have lost parents to suicide that really models this great, because they talk to the children there to a large degree in very frank terms. What does it mean when someone dies? It means they cannot breathe anymore. They can't eat with us. They can't do this. Their functions just stop. And the big thing that I got from our work with local school systems and such, when I was listening to our expert on grief talking about how you talk to children, is the big thing is don't lie to the kids. There was a story about one school where a child had a brain tumor, and the classmates were told that the child had an earache. Well, then the child died. So how do you reconcile that? How does the child feel when they get an earache? How do they feel when they find out that it wasn't the truth? How does that give them a concept of trusting their authority figures and all that stuff? And it's never done with a malicious intent. I just think that the outcome is
It can be
less than optimal.
right. Is there anything else that you can think of from our talk that you want to expand on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I can talk about this for days and circle back around and repeat myself. But the big thing that I would encourage people to do is not everyone should pre-plan their funeral, prepay their funeral, but everyone should plan it.
Okay.
Even if it's just a sheet of paper, you write down the basics. And when someone is in a terminal situation, just like I think that a lot of times people feel like when they call hospice, they're giving up, so they put it off as long as they can. Mm-hmm. And then hospice doesn't have an opportunity to do their best work, mm-hmm. because their best work takes place over time. And so the same thing too with funerals. If people are able to engage in the planning process when it's not right on them, they're able to give some conscious thought, they're able to talk to their family, they're able to really decide what they want. And that's a lot better than when someone passes away and they feel like they need to get it done with those 3 days to get off from work. Mm-hmm. And so, trying to look at it as a part of the natural cycle and to try to deal with it and to face that reality. Now, I'm sitting here and I've told my dad I need to update his, and I told my mom I want to update hers. Mine probably needs to be updated. So we're all human, and we end up procrastinating. But it's a very valuable thing.
So what tools do you suggest that are used to make end-of-life decisions?
That light bulb, I can't believe what that's doing. So one of the best things, if I was going into the medical profession, or if I could make everyone read one book, it'd be Atul Gawande's latest book on being mortal or being mortal. And Atul Gawande is one of my favorite authors. I started reading him because some of the stuff that he writes is applicable to organizations and businesses. Mm-hmm. But this is really kind of an examination of the American approach to death, and the approach to death of the American medical community, and what the challenges are. And I think that it can be very informative. It's a greatest hits among hospice workers that I've met, and I would really encourage everyone to read that book.
Okay.
Don't make the mistake that I made and read it on vacation. It won't be a very happy vacation. But it's a challenging book, mm-hmm. but it's a very good book, and you will get a lot of benefit from it.
And you said it was Atul Gawande?
Atul Gawande.
Gawande.
He is a professor at I believe for Harvard. He's a general surgeon, and he's a writer for the New Yorker, I believe.
Okay, that's wonderful. I really appreciate your time today.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to working with you some more.
Thank you very much. I look forward to it too. And for those of you on video land, if you can hear that light bulb whistling, I'm sorry.
They may or not.